Greetings, listeners, and welcome to On the Spectrum podcast, a show that explores the many complexities and diversities of being on the spectrum. We are your hosts, David and Lorena.
Hello, everybody.
And today we're going to be discussing with our guests the process of diagnosing autism. Hello, Kat and Holly, and thank you very much for joining us on our third episode of On the Spectrum podcast. Would you like to start by telling our listeners a little bit about yourselves? Do you want to start with you, Kat?
Of course. So my name's Katherine Goodsell, and I'm a consultant forensic and chartered psychologist, and I specialise in autism diagnostics alongside many other diagnoses as well as therapy. My background is forensic mental health, prison service, quite a while ago, and then also worked within CAMS for diagnoses, and more recently I've been in private practice and working in autism diagnostics and comorbidities, as well as expert witness work for criminal court cases.
Wow, great stuff.
Holly.
I know, Holly.
Hi, so my name's Holly Armitage-Brown. I'm currently an assistant psychologist working alongside Kat. So I've recently graduated from my master's degree, which I did in forensic psychology. And prior to that, I did my undergraduate degree in psychology and criminology. And hoping to do my PhD soon. That's sort of the next stage.
Oh, great. Cool. Awesome. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're just going to be talking about the diagnosis of autism and kind of like the process of it. So do you want to kick off with a question?
Yeah, so we know that there have been some changes in the criteria lately, and we have things like the Asperger's syndrome came in the DSM-4, and now when they review and created the DSM-5, that syndrome was disappeared and everything was included within the autism umbrella, wasn't it? So could you explain us how that does it work for you guys in practice, and why all these changes and how that comes along?
So when it was changed, they decided it would be better to have it to an all-inclusive under one umbrella, which would then aid people not only in diagnosis but also moving things forward in terms of care afterwards. As a clinician, when they first made the changes, I wasn't particularly on board with the changes in terms of how their perception was. And actually, 10 years on, I still feel that differentiation is really important, because if we look at autism and we look at autism spectrum, if we look at PDD, NOS, which is pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, which also goes into atypical autism. We look at Asperger's, as it was once known. We look at Rett syndrome. They're all very different, and how they impact on people is very, very different. So as a clinician, even though they have removed this, it's still something that can be helpful to consider these differentiations even when we're diagnosing now.
Okay. Have you seen any difference or how it's affecting the clients or people actually? So are they taking on board the change, or they still want to say, I'm Asperger or I am autistic?
In the main, most people would like the differentiation. Okay. So a lot of people who come and have assessments with us in private practice, or whether it's when I was contracting for the NHS and when I had contracts to go and deliver autism assessments for the NHS, there was very much this feel that, particularly with adults, if it's autism or autism spectrum, other people, perhaps their employers, aren't going to understand the differences between how they were functioning, which was more in line with what they felt as being Asperger's, to what the typical perspective or the stereotypical perspective is of autism, because they're so diverse. So a lot of people have struggled with not coming to terms with it essentially, but being able to ask whether it's okay if they still use Asperger's, which under ICD-10 is more of a possibility. Under the DSM, it's not. So quite often I will say to people, if we look at the diagnosis, I will always tailor everything to the individual anyway, because everyone's unique, whether they are on the spectrum or they're not. So it's always tailored. And I will say to them that if you feel more comfortable saying, yes, I've got autism spectrum, However, it's felt to be more of the Asperger's type because it is very different in how it was in the DSM-4, then that should be absolutely acceptable.
Okay.
Fair enough.
Yeah. Makes sense.
So it's almost like you say it was up to the individual whether they come under the umbrella term or whether they'd prefer to have that specific diagnosis. Is that kind of what you're saying? Or?
So it would be more in line of if we do the autism assessment and it's felt from my opinion or a clinician's opinion when we're doing the diagnostic assessments that actually their history, their presentation, obviously delivering the gold standard assessments is absolutely essential. Delivering a multitude of other assessments, in my opinion, is really, really beneficial. So you get a really comprehensive view of this person. If, as a clinician, you feel that perhaps they may have met that threshold for Asperger's and they want to know that, then it can be helpful to let them know that if we were diagnosing back in 2013, then yes, then
you will use those tools to clarify and make that differentiation between what is
that
autism.
Differentiation, not diagnostically, but more in a qualitative way of just saying, well, yes, if we were diagnosing then, you may have met threshold for Asperger's. We're not diagnosing under the DSM with Asperger's, but it's more comfortable quite often if they would have met threshold for Asperger's that they can explain that to their employer because it's so different in that way. But they would have to, in the clinician's perspective, meet that threshold because there is that disparity between.
Oh, I see. So it's almost they have to have that in order to get sort of the right support or the specific things that they're going to need support with.
They could do because it is different.
Sure.
Very different. And when we look at the stereotypical view of autism, quite often, and forgive me if this is very sort of wide-ranging for what people say to me, a lot of people say, well, our view of autism spectrum or autism essentially is either Rain Man, or which is a very old film now, or someone who's non-verbal and doesn't have that ability to communicate, or they see it also as a learning disability, which obviously it isn't. So having that differentiation, in my opinion, is really important, which is why whenever you're assessing, you have to treat people very uniquely, and you assess that person not as a collective because you've been trained to do it, but because that person needs to have their assessment tailored to them. And it doesn't matter whether that also includes cognitive assessments, adaptive behaviour assessments. It has to be tailored to that individual to make sure you get the best outcome for them.
That's great.
Because even when we're in the umbrella, they're still unique for who they are. It won't be two people with autism the same, and I think we see this every day.
We see this every day at the school. Every child has an individual timetable, don't they?
And,
it's like it's all tailored towards
themselves.
Their needs.
Like that uniqueness is like what we don't want to lose, and sometimes we forget. And also I want to say that yes, I think many people have that stereotype of what is autism, and they see that disability attached to autism. And I think we have a conversation not long ago with someone that is perfectly capable to carry on his life, and when he went to do an interview at work, they were like treating him like he was disabled, and he's like, but I'm not disabled. So autism doesn't mean disability. Autism means that I understand life or the world in a different way. That's it. Doesn't mean that I'm not able to. So I think that is more common than we think. So probably that's why that's what we are trying to break those stereotypes and those to break those barriers of like widen the view of what autism means.
Absolutely, and that's something that I think, particularly over the last sort of 14 years that I've been specialising in autism, and I was a teacher before, so teaching the individual is absolutely essential. But in the last sort of 14 years I've worked in autism, it is so essential to actually support the individual, and when you're assessing, it has to be assessing the individual. And one of the things that, and it doesn't really matter what age the person is for this, when parents come or teachers ask questions, I always try and explain it that autism, for me, and when we look at autism compared to neurotypical, it's like having a Windows computer, an Apple computer, or phone and phone, Android, rubbish with technology. And both fundamentally they do the same thing. There's just different operating systems. And if there's different operating systems, it doesn't mean that someone is going to be disadvantaged. We just need to think about things in a slightly different way to help the person who's either neurotypical or neurodiverse.
Someone that is within the spectrum, let's say.
Absolutely.
Because they're capable of doing the same thing, but they may have sensory issues or something that may sort of get in the way. But once those are removed, they're perfectly capable, just as anyone else, to do the task at hand.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the time when we see things being a little bit more tricky is when there is a comorbidity. So obviously, having a background in forensic mental health, I used to work a lot with autism wards, essentially, in secure mental health. And that would be very different because we would see a lot of comorbidities. So we would have autism with a learning disability, autism with psychosis. In that context, it's something that needs a lot more support, not just because autism spectrum's there, it's also because there's a fundamental sort of learning disability or there's psychosis. So in that respect, it is different. However, autism spectrum, particularly when people don't have additional needs, and we always have to remember that neurotypical people can also have additional needs such as learning disabilities, psychosis, anxiety, depression, personality disorders, and we can go through a whole entire list. It doesn't make any difference. It's just a different way of accommodating any particular needs.
That's it. So how early you can make a diagnosis of autism and how so that is reliable, so more or less?
It differs from clinician to clinician. So when I was contracted to the NHS, I contracted to paediatrics in London for a while, years ago now. And that was from 18 months up to 5 years for that particular service. I am of the view that that is incredibly young.
I thought that was quite a young
age, in my opinion, because the developmental stages that children go through from sort of 6 months to 12 months to 18 months to 2 years are huge, absolutely huge. And when you see that development happen, and you've had someone that's diagnosed at 18 months because someone's not talking, and you think, well, actually, a lot of children don't talk because they all develop differently. So how about just waiting a little bit longer? That can be really beneficial. In my opinion, I fully appreciate lots of clinicians will do things very differently. My preference is sort of 5 years because the diagnostic criteria, if we look at the algorithm, the main algorithm for the ADIR is 4 to 5 years. So if we wait to 5 years, but we put accommodations in for anyone younger, in case there is autism there that would relate to it in schools, etc., then that's helpful.
That's proactive, just in case.
Absolutely, right. Being proactive is the most essential thing. But if we look at waiting till 5, and we can do the ADOS, we can do the ADIR, we can do all the other forms, we've got the school perspective, I think that makes a huge difference. And
I suppose by then you've gathered up enough evidence as well, because the nurseries would have gathered evidence, so the school, and then you've got, I see what you're saying there.
Absolutely.
So you've got more sort of conclusive, like you can conclusively say there's something going on here.
You can, and that's, I appreciate my opinion. There are lots of other opinions out there, but in my opinion, I feel it's better to wait until 5 unless something is very, very, very starkly clear-cut. So I'm not saying I haven't diagnosed under 5, I have, but it would have to be incredibly clear-cut, and that would be very much the body mannerisms, the complex body mannerisms that also go hand in hand with autism spectrum. Very clear-cut, non-verbal, or particular sounds that are being made. The body mannerisms are often spinning in circles, dropping things from a particular height repetitively, which typically children don't do consistently, but they will do for a period of time, which is why it has to have that longevity in order to gather that evidence, because without that evidence and you diagnose someone who hasn't got it, that's a lot more damaging to somebody than waiting that little bit longer to diagnose.
Thinking about the earliest stage in children, if you think, I've got a kid that is 16 months old now, David has a child as well, 3. So how they play in quite repetitive schemas that they play in schemas that they have, and even Montessori talk about that. It's sometimes quite repetitive. So if, like, for someone, if you take that out of context, can be something like, oh, it's autism, it could be autism. And it's like, no, it's just how they play and how they understand the world that is around them. And then that will evolve to something else. But to allow that evolution, you need to do this first. If we go to the 18 months, and I can remember when I studied the degree, they were saying even between 12 and 18, which for me was quite early, but yeah, I remember the teacher, and it was really close to the medicine side. It was like between 12 and 18, there's things that you can see already, that they are there. A child, when you do this and doesn't want to come to you, and I was like, but really? I mean, it's those kind of little things that are we not taking things out of context, or they can be taken out of context really quickly by professionals and parents. And the only thing that we are doing is scaring people and putting labels that they are no needs that early.
Parents worry. And rightly so. I have 3 children.
We do.
we worry a lot. And we look for things. And even as a psychologist, you know, when I had my first, I was like, oh, this, because obviously I was working in autism at the time.
Tell about.
Yeah.
Tell us about it. Yeah.
Over a decade working together.
You do. And my son had delayed speech. He doesn't stop talking now, does he? No. And he isn't on the spectrum, but if someone had thought about looking at the time, he lined up cars, loved cars. Yep. He would be very repetitive in certain words, but that's the only speech he wanted to use because everyone spoke for him.
There you go. So it's like out of context, things can go really wrong really quickly, do they?
And there's a natural regression, is what I was, because I work in the speech and language therapy department, and they said that there's a natural, like, for a few weeks, your child will regress back to being non-verbal for a little while. And that's a natural thing, and I think a lot of people will probably worry at that stage when that kind of thing happens, but you have to sort of, like you said, kind of take note, but then carry on and just see through that developmental process.
Absolutely, particularly if they've got older siblings or parents who are very communicative. I think most parents have probably been guilty of, would you like that juice? Let me give you the juice. So you're not allowing the child to say, I'd really like some juice, or would you like some chips? Oh, here you go. So you're not allowing that sort of development. So they think, oh, I don't actually need to talk, you're just going to give me what I want, which a lot of children do. And if we think about my daughter, who's 10 now, she's ADHD, sensory processing disorder, dyspraxia and dyslexia. And if I looked back at when she was 3, absolutely 3, she didn't play, had no interest in playing whatsoever. She would rather watch television, very passive. Her speech was quite delayed. Her brother was talking for her by that point.
Convincing.
Absolutely.
That's really good.
But the sensory side was so apparent. And I knew she had sensory processing difficulties from when she was under 12 months, because it was so apparent.
What was one of the red flags for that?
She would only eat porridge for about 8 months.
I see. Textures of food and things.
Oh, yes. Right. And bright light. She'd be like,
Oh, I see.
So, yeah, she was very sensory and noise. She'd be like, So with her, if I'd taken her to someone at 3, she wouldn't have spoken to anybody. She wouldn't have engaged. She wouldn't have pointed. She wouldn't have directed people. She could.
She was ticking many boxes that we were talking about, wouldn't it? Like,
Absolutely.
they would have said and gave her diagnosis probably that was incorrect.
Absolutely. Because if I tried to play peekaboo with her, because she processes visually so quickly, I was boring. So me going, peekaboo, she'd be like, and on to the next thing. So all of those things that we look at for the tiny tots actually were probably relevant for her. She isn't autism spectrum, but she's ADHD and a whole host of other little bits going on too. So I fully get where you're coming from in terms of what you were saying, that you've got to be so careful when you are diagnosing that we have it for a prolonged period, not just, for 3 months, this has been happening.
Yes, because a friend of mine said that he went in for an assessment for his child, and they took him away for about 90 minutes and then brought him back and then said, he might be on the spectrum or something along them lines. But his argument was, well, you've only taken him for 90 minutes. How do you know? You know, and what you're saying makes more sense, in my opinion anyway, is that you gather up the evidence so that you can be quite conclusive of what your findings are.
Absolutely, and gathering up the evidence is really important. So if we look at the diagnostic process, and it again, it depends what individual clinicians want to do. I've always only ever used gold standard assessments because apparently I'm very pedantic. So the ADOS, ADIR, the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, beforehand now, the second version, and then the Autism Diagnostic Interview Revised. So the ADIR assessment can take anywhere from sort of 2 hours to 5 hours to complete. Longest one I did was 7 hours. It's very long. And that's to gather a full developmental history. Now, obviously that can be done when someone's 5 for the 4 to 5 period. It can be done younger than that, which will gather some evidence. But obviously going with what we said a few minutes ago, sometimes we do need to wait that little bit longer. Then the ADOS is a very structured assessment. That is shorter. Absolutely, it can be up to an hour. And the ADOS is done with the child. But you also need to have nursery perspective. You need to have the school's perspective. If we're doing assessments, we do the ADOS 2. A separate clinician will do the ADIR. The school will have a social responsiveness scale and a MIGDAS teacher version. So we have the qualitative and the quantitative. The parents will also have the SRS2, and they will have a sensory profile. And then we also look at the Beck Youth Inventory because it's really important to look at possible comorbidity of anxiety, low mood, anger, disruptive behaviour, that side of things too. And we also look at the adaptive behaviour system for children if we feel there's something else going on, and also for adults. So you're getting a much more well-rounded, comprehensive picture of somebody. The ADIR and the ADOS are the gold standard ones. The others are just other ones which I feel complement it, because they're quite intensive assessments. And we do have, if there's any question at all, if the ADOS has been done and everything else has been done, and we have any questions whatsoever, we can also do a MIGDAS with a child as well, just to gather further information. So it's much more intensive than just taking a child away for 90 minutes.
Yeah, sure.
Now that you're talking about red flags, what red flags would you say to parents that there are things that they need to look into, and if those appear, is something that we might need to move a step forward?
What age would you be considering?
What age do you want? Like, for instance, let's say 4 or 5 years old. So let's say till 4 or 5 things can move forward, and they can take with a pinch of salt. But if they are 4 or 5 and those things appeared, what are those things?
So 4 to 5, if we're thinking particularly sort of the latter end of 4 to 5, if we're seeing delayed echolalia, which is a child repeating a sentence or a phrase, but it has to be verbatim, several hours, can even be days or even weeks later, and that can be something someone said to them, or it can be something they've heard on television, but it's the exact phrase and they repeat it out of context, that can be a sign. Stereotyped utterances, so for example, all traffic lights are pink. We know they're not. But if it's a statement that's completely out of context, that makes no sense in that situation, and it's something that they just say, that can be too, if we're looking at the speech particularly.
Is that because the understanding is not there and they're just repeating what's...
It can be. Or their favourite colour might be pink.
Oh, I see. Oh, okay. Right.
It can be lots of different things. But it's definitely around something that is an unusual thing for a child to say. If we look at speech being delayed sort of towards the 5-year-old domain, really, if they're requiring speech and language therapy, but it isn't around subtle pronunciation, or they have a lisp. I've got a lisp. I still have a lisp. I've had one since I was born. Well, I'm not born, since I was speaking. You know, it's more than that. It's that speech and language that's actually developing their speech. So if they need that at 5, then yes, I'd probably say look at that. If you're seeing hand flapping, finger mannerisms, it can be really subtle. I'm exaggerating them slightly, but it can be very subtle.
Things that probably, like, it will clarify, because we are doing the podcast, so it can be audio, but also we are in YouTube. So if parents are seeing us, it will be probably a way to clarify what I'm talking about. Absolutely.
So those sorts of behaviours, the hand flapping, this one particularly, that can be quite a sensory therapeutic one. So if we're seeing that, absolutely, that can be definitely a sign. So those repetitive behaviours, spinning in a circle with but it's not spinning in circles in running, it's spinning, 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 spinning. So a very
spinning
close circle.
Or themselves running around.
But they're normally looking for the visual stimulation. So for example, if they're looking at this, they'll be spinning, 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 but they'll be looking for that visual stimulation to almost make that become something different. Okay. Obviously with sensory processing disorder, it is a standalone condition as well. It doesn't always come with autism or ADHD or other conditions, so it can be standalone, but it can be also important when combined with other areas of any concern. School is a big one, so not approaching other children, not watching other children. So some children on the spectrum will actually watch other children, they'll observe, but they won't approach them. They'll just be standing there watching. Okay. I appreciate that can also be part of other conditions, but that can be something. And if someone comes over and says, do you want to come and play? Do you want to come and play with them? And they're sort of, oh, no. Yes, it can be an anxiety base, but it can also be a sign that they don't want to, and quite often they'll walk away. So they won't communicate it. It'll be sort of a walk away. Okay. If another child approaches them and they're not interested, they're not communicating, and they're just happy doing their own thing. And quite often children can be happy doing their own thing. It's often parents, we worry because we want them to be doing other stuff. But they're happy doing their own thing. Then that can be a sign as well, even if other people are approaching. Birthday parties are a classic one. So, yeah, going to a birthday party and a child hiding behind, wanting to escape, in the corner, hand over ears, that can also be a sign that there might be something a little bit happening there.
Something is different, yeah.
Definitely.
But you could appreciate it could also be anxiety at the same time as well.
Anxiety.
So it's kind of like you pick up the red flag, but obviously it just goes towards this portfolio that you're putting together.
Absolutely.
So it's not like a definite in stone.
No.
But it's worth taking note if these kind of things happen.
It's looking for that differential diagnosis as well as a clinician, absolutely. But just recording these things, but it would be a long-term thing, not just a one-off or wasn't feeling well that day, so therefore this has happened. So it would be a long-term sort of difficulty that's happening.
And few of them probably won't be something isolated, like not wanting to go to a birthday party one day. Will be something that has been repeated alongside other things that you mentioned probably. Absolutely.
Routine, difficulties with change. Lots of children are adaptable, lots of children aren't adaptable. But particularly with autism spectrum, you will have children who they will want to do this and it will be, why? If it changes, because they're struggling to process, or they'll go very quiet and they'll withdraw. But you might still see them have what is classed as a meltdown because they're struggling with that change. And that's often with autism something they don't want to do and something they do want to do. So children are very clever. We know they're very clever. When they don't want to do something, it's like, oh, brilliant, I don't have to do that, so I'm not going to get cross over it. Lots of children with autism spectrum, if it's something they don't want to do and it changes, it's that change that causes the difficulty. Not the fact that, I don't want to do it, so I get to go and play, if that makes sense. And it's the quality of play, it's the quality of those interactions. So are they demanding that situation? Does everyone have to follow what they're saying? So, for example, a classic one would be trains or cars. The yellows go here, the reds go here, the blues go here. If you switch it round, what happens? If you see a child go, yellow, and you put it over here, and yellow, and you can see that distress, that's also possibly symptomatic.
How would you say that the diagnostic process for autism normally unfolds for individuals and for their families?
It varies. Do you want me to talk about it generally or in terms of what I would do specifically?
Probably what would you do?
What would I do? Again, I'm called quite pedantic. I like to think of it being more thorough, but hey, that's what my husband said, I'm very pedantic. I always feel if you're going to do something, you've got to do it to the best of what you can to get the best outcome for a family, for a child.
That's been a good professional then.
I hope so. I hope so.
Let's put the right terms there.
So. Yeah. So how I would do it, we do the gold standard assessments, we do the ADOS, the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, we do the ADIR, the Autism Diagnostic Interview Revised. Both of those give us a wealth of information, both observation and then obviously interviewing parents or a guardian or someone who's known that individual really well. We then do further assessments with school. We do school observations if needs be as well. We give the school qualitative and quantitative measures which allow us to work out a little bit more about what's going on for that person. I say a little bit, quite a lot actually for that person. We always look at sensory. We always look at sort of the mental health side as well, just in case, because there's recommendations that need to be made if that person needs support. We look at adaptive behaviours, so daily living, how they're functioning, whether there's any struggles within that as well. We look at cognitive, if that's helpful too. Generally, that's if there's a concern in an adult with a learning disability, then a cognitive should be a prerequisite, to be fair, particularly under NICE guidelines. And with a child, a cognitive can be helpful, particularly around processing, particularly around working memory, verbal comprehension, just in case we can see any spiky profiles. Can be an indicator of dyslexia, of course, but just looking at those spiky profiles as well, if there's any concerns in school about the accessing academics too. So a well-rounded assessment should be undertaken. It does take time, and I think that's something that a lot of people struggle with. We can't gather this information in 2 days. It takes us time to gather it, it takes us time to formulate it, it takes us time to work through everything, and sometimes we do need further information. So having an assessment that's done in that way is my preference.
Okay, so when they have the diagnosis, what is the next step?
The next step, it does depend on age, very much so. So if a child is having a diagnosis, then it's recommendations for school and also for home. It can be recommendations also for CAMS, if they're under CAMS, and what they might wish to consider as well. Obviously, when we look at autism diagnoses, we always look at the differential diagnosis. So someone might come for an autism assessment, but I also look at whether there might be ADHD there, whether there might be sensory difficulties, which obviously are quite comorbid with autism spectrum. We do look at the mental health side as well. If we're looking at that side, then it's making those recommendations. Do they need therapy? Looking at attachment difficulties as well, particularly if someone's been adopted or in foster care. I was
going to ask whether the environment sort of comes into it as well, whether there's something, if you've got a house full, for example, or things like that, that might, would they exhibit behaviours that would be red flags, maybe if they were in an environment they're not comfortable with at home?
Absolutely. So it can exacerbate some of that symptomology in certain contexts, definitely.
So it's worth looking into that area just to rule it out and say, oh, well, if you change this at home, then maybe these behaviours might stop, potentially.
Yes.
Right.
And that's why trauma is a really important area to look at, because there's so many crossovers between autism spectrum, trauma, attachment difficulties, so it really depends on the individual. I'm an EMDR practitioner as well, so I specialise in trauma as well. So having that understanding is really important, because getting an accurate interpretation, for want of a better word, for that person is important for their well-being and also moving forward. So those recommendations are based around a really comprehensive assessment of what I feel, the team, my team feels.
There's a lot of bodies involved in this, and a lot of different facilitators.
Absolutely, definitely. Which is why particularly children's assessments should be done by an MDT. So you don't just have one.
So the next step essentially would be that all these other parties get involved and try and have this holistic sort of approach or view of this individual. Yeah.
Absolutely, it's taking those individual parts, coming together and saying, well, this is what was felt here, this is what was felt here, this is what was felt here. Where do we go from here? And quite often it does match in terms of information. Obviously, it doesn't always match. So then we will then look, within our practice, we will always then like, well, why is it not matching? What do we need to do? So depends on who's delivered the ADIR. So it's come to a point sometimes where, quite recently, our ADIR practitioner, who's been delivering ADIRs for years and years and years and has worked for CAMS for years, previously delivered the ADIR. I did the ADOS too. Another psychologist did the initial consultation, and there wasn't an agreement there between the parents. So Holly's ADIR trained as well. So she did another ADIR,
Yes.
and our other ADIR practitioner who'd already done that one asked more questions from the original parents so we could actually ascertain what was going on. So it's going beyond what's right in front of you and gathering more information.
So is that a lot of what you guys do as well, is like when these conflicts arrive, you have to sort of like come up with some kind of agreeable direction to go with?
That's my preference, and I know that's not how a lot of people do it. It's a yes or no for autism when they're doing these diagnoses. I think because, and I might be wrong, I think because I'm a forensic psychologist, I'm very evidence-led, and because I do a lot of criminal court cases for autism, ADHD, trauma, personality disorders, all the way through mental health to psychopathy. I've just been very lucky in my background and experience to be able to specialise in all of these areas. I like to try and find out what is happening for someone if I can. And obviously when we look at sort of attachment theory, which is another area I work a lot within too, then if we can ascertain what's going on to help somebody, for me that's really important. I think saying to someone, no, it's not autism spectrum, off you go, that can be such a harsh reality for that person because they don't know where to go next. And it's not saying that I can resolve it straight away because I won't be able to, but it might be, for example, for court purposes, I will diagnose ADHD. I'm trained to diagnose it. I'm trained in DIVA and etc. For children, I won't, and I won't privately, purely because I'm not a medical doctor. I can't prescribe medication, and obviously ADHD is medication-based. So in that situation where I feel it's not autism spectrum, and as a team we feel it isn't, then I will refer to psychiatry. We'll do the Connors forms or the CARS forms because that's fair to do, and then we'll refer to psychiatry and refer to, if they want, we can recommend somebody, if they'd rather seek their own person. So we will always try and give them a direction in which to go.
So we're talking about the age of 4 or 5. So we are talking about an early diagnosis all the time. So why is that important? How that reflects within the individual? What is the impact of having an early diagnosis? Because we know that sometimes people live with autism without knowing that they're autistic. And then actually when they realize that they are autistic or they find out, it's really late. And it's like bringing light to their lives because they click on like, oh, so now I understand why all of these happen, or why I do how I do, or how I talk, why I talk, you know, like it's like an explanation of many things. So why is that early diagnosis key?
It does vary, to be fair. So if we look at autism spectrum, and we know it's definitely there, 4 to 5, it can be so important educationally to get that help in place, to get an EHCP as soon as possible, to make sure their educational needs are met, their wellbeing needs are met, that they're getting that support in terms of groups, social groups at school, social stories, storyboarding. All of those things can be really helpful to help children develop certain skills that perhaps haven't come naturally to them when they're very young. For parents, it's the same. So it's helping children when they're really young to learn that they might just need that little bit of support to be able to make friends, to be able to look at things in a way where their friend, for example, doesn't want to play the game they want to play, but they really want to play that game, and they're not going to talk to anyone unless they play that game, so they walk off. So it's being able to help children say, well, actually, we do need to try and look at things in a slightly different way, because theory of mind essentially isn't something that many people on the spectrum really do have naturally. It's something that has to be learned. So giving that sort of perspective, and if we do that young, that can be really, really beneficial for someone in friendships, for mental health, because a lot of people say, particularly the older they are, but I feel different, I felt different all of my life. Is there something wrong with me? And your heart just breaks, because it's not there's something wrong with somebody. It's just that they haven't felt that they fit in with this person, and they haven't felt they fit in with people in the main. So it isn't about them not fitting in, it's about them understanding that actually they're okay as they are. If we can start that young, it makes a massive difference.
Sure. So it's like their well-being, their happiness and their self-esteem and things that that kind of stuff will affect.
Absolutely.
So getting that in early is going to help with that kind of thing, so they don't get to the point where they think like, oh, why am I so different?
Absolutely. And also, I think it's really important that some children really don't want to go and socialise. And parents encouraging taking children. Off we go, we're going to socialise over here, and we're going to go and do this, and go and play with this person. Off we go to this party, and children are like, oh, I don't want to do this. It's about helping parents know that actually their children are happy doing their own thing. It's not the child that's unhappy, it's the parent worrying the child's unhappy because they're not engaging in what they perceive as
I think people tend to compare a lot. So I don't know in your experience, but I have this a lot where when my son was born, everyone was comparing, oh, but his cousin does this and this happens, and and I just think that's just something that is natural. Like you said, people are just worrying and almost looking out for these red flags like constantly, rather than just engaging with the child as they are.
So guys, we're talking about comparing, and I think for us parents, it's normal that we are always, even when we don't want to do it,
we end up comparing what stage they're at.
Yeah, my son is not doing still, but then, or we talk, it's even like with the teeth. Oh, how many teeth your son has? Like, how's that important? It's not really important. So even to that stage, I had that kind of questions, which is absolutely fine, but sometimes leads to difficult situations, especially for those parents that they realize. Because when I did a degree, the first thing that they tell you, parents know their children absolutely well. That's the best people you can talk to. So you realize and pick up really quickly that actually something is different. We're not going to say wrong, we're going to say different. So how do you think, or from your experience and perspective, how parents live all of this process? Like, since they realize that something is different, they start comparing their children with others through going to, they don't want to go to the birthday parties, we go to the birthday parties and we end up having tantrums, and then all the children looking at, all the parents looking at, so we end up not being invited to any of them, because this is a process as well for the family, isn't it? So how you see from your perspective all of this from the family point of view, so how the families live all of this?
So you're absolutely right, parents do compare. They really do. And I would love to say that I never did it. I did. All three of mine. Because you just do. And it's a natural thing. And it isn't just your own children. You'll have other parents say, well, my child's doing this at this age and my child's doing this. And you're thinking, okay, this is great. My child is just about starting to crawl. It does happen. And I think it's a natural thing for parents to do. It isn't always helpful, because actually children are unique. And they all meet their milestones at different times. And whether that's speech, whether it's bladder control, bowel control, whether it's walking, they all meet them at different times. And I think if you have one child, you tend to see some advancement in some areas for that child. Second one, sometimes you see a little bit less, sometimes a little bit more. Third one, sometimes the other two are doing so much for them, they don't actually want to do anything except be weighted on hand and foot, like my third one. So in that sort of context, it is very much about knowing your child, comparing them to other children. I know why parents do it, I really do. And it isn't always helpful, because getting to know the individual sort of needs of your child, what they're responding to, will be much more helpful if there's any concerns moving forward, particularly if they're going through an assessment.
Definitely. And I think it can be, some parents take ASD diagnoses really well, and it's really beneficial for the child. But some parents can find it a harder process, can't they?
Yeah.
Definitely. So I also think it's really useful for parents to seek out support groups and for, to talk to somebody else who's going through perhaps the diagnostic process, or to speak to another parent who's also had their child diagnosed. I think that's really beneficial to speak to somebody who understands, someone who's been through it, because it can be a really challenging time.
You can say that they're not alone, for example. You can bring that into the perspective.
Definitely.
Yeah. And is there a process of, because I've always thought that maybe parents may have an expectation, or they're expecting to do certain things with their children, and is there a process where they have to kind of maybe manage those expectations a little bit better?
Yes, probably. Yeah. I think if we look at and I'm obviously not a paediatrician, but I contracted to the NHS for paediatric assessments years ago. So I work really closely with a lot of paediatricians who are lovely, and their assessments are very different to what perhaps mine would be. So it's, has this child met this, and this? And they're looking at it from a very medical point of view. Mm-hmm. And it's perhaps not looking at the parameters, can be a little bit different for all children, whether they are on the spectrum or they're not on the spectrum. We just need that little bit of leeway almost to allow children within their own environments, their own context of parenting, etc., just to be able to progress at their own pace in many ways. And then if we do get to ages, for example, they say that the criteria is sort of 18 months. Is someone walking by 18 months, or are they not walking by 18 months? If they're not walking by 18 months, then it's a red flag. Are they speaking by 2 years, as in a meaningful single word, not mama or dada? Are they saying an actual word such as juice or no by the age of 2? If they're not, it's seen as a bit of a red flag, but that one I think needs to be aired with a bit of caution, because children do speak at different times. Mm. So looking at those milestones is really important when they're very, very young, but just giving a little bit of leeway depending on their environment, depending on parenting, depending on brothers, sisters and wider family, just to allow that development to happen.
I think it's the patience though as well that it must take, especially when you're going through that process yourself. Like you said, it can take a long time to gather all this information, and at the same time you've also got to be patient, thinking to yourself, well, I was hoping that by this stage we'd be doing this or that, but then you just got to hold it in and be like, well, I've just got to wait until they're ready, like you say.
Absolutely, with those very sort of typical milestones, definitely. You really do. Patience is key. If you're seeing many more of the stereotypical behaviours that we talked about earlier, then perhaps they're a little bit more along the lines of red flags.
Yeah, and we explore all the motor milestones during the ADIR assessment, which I do. And like you were saying, we always give a bit of leeway and look at what else is going on around that. So like you were saying, siblings, and we also look at if there's been a loss of language skills or other more general skills at any point. As we were saying earlier, so we look at that as well.
Mm-hmm. Which ones are the misconceptions or the fears that parents have when you bring the diagnosis forward? So you do all the assessment, everything is done, it's clear that it's a child that is on the spectrum, or you can say is autistic. Now you pass the information to the family. What you see from the families, or where is the fears that come along with that diagnosis, which I guess they will come, few of them.
Absolutely. It really, you can see just how much it impacts a lot of people, and their fears are about their children's future, or if they're adults, it's about their future as well, whether it's a parent who's with them, whether it's a partner. It's about the fears for their future, how they're going to manage in school, how they're going to manage at university, how they're going to manage in work. And for me, it's always been about using strengths. Everyone has strengths. Everybody has difficulties. Doesn't matter whether they're on the spectrum, they're neurotypical, it makes no difference. Everyone has difficulties. So it's using those strengths and putting it in a really positive way and saying, well, actually your child is really good at this, and giving them that sort of positive way of looking at things and explaining it the way that I mentioned earlier around Windows, Android and Apple. That really helps people in order to determine actually it's not something that's wrong, because it isn't. It is a different way of looking at the world.
Understand, yeah.
Absolutely, and a different way of understanding. And sometimes it's not actually about, and this is going to sound very, this is what a lot of parents have said to me, I need you to fix my child. And it isn't about fixing a child, it's not about fixing anybody. It's about helping parents or partners understand that actually this person loves this, and this. Let's use this, because that's really going to be useful to harness moving forward. And fixing someone isn't something we'd ever want to do, because we don't want to, for want of a better word, fix someone who's neurodiverse.
It's who they are, essentially, and you'll be trying to take
it's
that
changing
away.
the way they are, isn't it?
Absolutely, because it would be the same thing with someone neurotypical. They have anxiety, they have depression. We want to help, and we want them to sort of learn how to sort of help themselves as well. So it's about using those strengths that somebody has if they're on the spectrum, harnessing those, putting those into the curriculum. So if they only love trains or cars, which I appreciate is very stereotypical of very young sort of boys in many respects, but if they don't want to read about other things, then buy train books and let's use that. And
use that as a catalyst for other learning tools that they can use.
Absolutely, and make the learning around what they're interested in. Because it isn't that they're, like we were saying earlier, it's not a disability in that respect. It's about using their abilities to really help them, whether it's academically, whether it's in work, whatever capacity, whether it's at home, and really using that to help them feel that they're okay as they are, because that's the most important thing.
Certainly, I think acceptance is a big thing as well. They just want to be accepted among their peers and things. And I remember when I worked in a school with children that had autism, the amount of information they knew about the subject that they love was incredible. And so you can see the capacity there. You can see that they have the ability to learn and to know things. But at that stage in their life, it was just a very specific subject. And that's okay, because at least it demonstrates the capacity is there.
Oh, absolutely. And thinking about someone I assessed probably about 9 years ago now, he ran his own company, was very, very academic, computer-based company, was brilliant at the technical side of it, and came to me and said, well, apparently they don't like me. So it's not they don't like you, but let's see what's going on. And when he realised that actually what was going on was autism spectrum, he's like, okay, so I've got something to work with. And he went back and he said, right, I've got autism spectrum. It's going to change something. Bless him. But actually what it did do was enable other people to say, okay, so perhaps we need to be a little bit more accommodating, because it's not you're blunt with us, it's not you're abrupt with us, it's just your way of communicating.
It's like we were expecting an Android phone to work as an iPhone. Yeah. And it's like that's the way we were clashing.
Okay, so based on what we were discussing, we just wanted to also get your views and opinions about the extended family and how that contributes to the individual child, because you've got the grandparents, you've got the aunties, the uncles, and sometimes, I suppose, when a diagnosis comes along, they might decide that they want to have an active role in what's going on in the process. And just to tell us a little bit about how that is in your experience.
It can be so beneficial. It really can, because sometimes, and this is just some examples that I can think of, when there isn't a diagnosis in place, and for me it's not about a label as such, it's about an understanding. And if you can understand what's going on for someone, then you can help to make things a lot easier for that person, but also their families. Sometimes from people I've worked with in the past, grandparents, for example, can be a little bit more reticent about a diagnosis, or a little bit more sort of, oh no, couldn't possibly. And actually working with them so they're on the same page is so important, because you do need everyone on the same page. You need that sort of collaborative support for a child or an adult, so they don't feel there is something wrong, because there isn't. It's about working together for the needs of that person and being able to facilitate the best you can an extended family, whether it's aunts, uncles, grandparents, cousins, even, friends, family friends, is so important in enabling someone to feel accepted and know that actually they are okay as they are, because that's really, really key. And
they're getting supported as well. And I suppose, does consistency come into play there as well? Like, if everyone, responds in the same manner, obviously they're going to feel more comfortable, I guess. And so it's good to communicate that with the family.
Oh, it is, absolutely, because, and certainly not everybody, but a lot of people on the spectrum are very routine-based. And if that gets disrupted, it doesn't always go particularly well. So it's about family recognising that, wider family, friends, thinking ahead sometimes, well, actually, if I change this last minute, that's not going to go particularly well. So let's see if we can find something that's a better alternative if we really have to cancel that. So it's always looking to mitigate what's going to impact on somebody, particularly children, definitely, because you don't want them feeling that they're reacting, because a lot of children do reflect after and think, and feel quite guilty. So it's about being able to work together to mitigate any difficulties, but actually to support that person to make sure that that consistency is managed in the way that is going to benefit the family.
And I guess to understand what's going on, because if we're having a meltdown, it's not because the child is naughty, it's not because parents are not severe enough or authoritarian enough, and they just need to, because sometimes it's like, just need to be firm and then say to him, this is right, this is wrong, or her, and it's like, actually it's not because of that, it's because of what we're saying, something has changed his routine or her routine that set them up for a crisis, and this is the way to say, I cannot cope with change, this is how it comes out, just understand, let it happen, we'll manage as we can. It's like, it's as well understanding, or the surrounding understanding why things happen, and like what is behind that. It's not only a naughty child or a parent that is not being a good parent, because I think parents feel quite judged. It's always
you feel
like
very responsible
the eyes looking at you, and you're not parenting appropriately or doing things right.
And I think that's another thing to point on as well, that extended family support is very good just for the parents as well as the child, just to make, because sometimes as a parent you need to go to somebody and be like, am I doing the right thing here? You need that kind of just maybe just discussing it to yourself is enough, but sometimes you just need that clarification that because no one's a professional parent. Everyone just has to just kind of wing it.
Children don't come with a manual.
Exactly. Yes.
They really don't.
They should have.
They should. I so agree. It's quite a shock, isn't it? We're like, hello.
Yes.
But they don't come with a manual, and every child's so different. And if you have one parent who is really authoritarian and another parent who isn't, and we come across it quite a lot, don't we?
Yeah.
And frustration, as any parent, it does happen. And it's not because a child is being naughty, they're not being difficult. It's because a child's trying to communicate to you. If it's non-verbally, they're communicating. And a meltdown is a form of communication.
To come through, definitely.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that can be in various formats of completely shutting down, hiding under a weighted blanket and not materialising for the next 2 hours. Or it can be what we often see also, rocking backwards and forwards, hands over ears, screaming, crying, repetitive noises. And that's a form of communication. It's a way of saying, I'm really unhappy and I don't know what to do because I can't cope with my emotions. And quite often with autism spectrum, it's very hard for someone, child or adult, to differentiate between their emotions and identify what's going on for them. Because, for example, excitement and anxiety, it can often feel the same inside, or they might not feel anything inside, so it's more intellectualized. So in that context, it's very difficult for someone to be able to interpret that. So explaining it's virtually impossible. So having someone who is authoritarian and someone who isn't, it's a lot of inconsistencies of being on the same page along with wider family. It's really essential.
So for all the parents that they are listening today, what advice do you have for parents who suspect their child might have autism, but they are unsure with what steps they need to take?
So it really depends, varies on age, definitely. So speak to the school, ask the school if they've any concerns, and quite often schools will raise any concerns that they do have. Read the school reports, just look and see whether there's any consistencies between school and home, or whether there's any vast inconsistencies between school and home, because we also have to consider masking. Girls, often their presentation is later than boys. Girls do tend to mask more, so taking that into consideration. Boys tend to display more behaviours, perhaps much younger. Girls typically can be much more in line with sort of 9 to 13 as that developmental gap starts to widen between them and their peers, and they start to think, well, why am my interest different? Why is this different? Why is that different? So look out for those things. Look out for children, particularly if they're really drained when they get home and their emotions, they're either hiding or they're letting everything out and they've been containing all day. So just let them talk, but keep an eye on it and see if it's a pattern, because when children get home, that's quite a key indicator of any difficulties, whether it's spectrum or not. Key indicator there might be something happening. If, like we said earlier, birthday parties are quite key, family gatherings. Just watch, just observe, and also talk to your child. You know, if you think they're struggling with something, just ask them, and ask them questions about, oh, who did you play with today? One thing I do with my children every day after school is say, what did you do today that was really fun? I don't ask them what they did today or how their day was. I always say to them, what did you do today that was really fun? And 2 of my children are neurodiverse. So using that sort of framework just enables their children to say, oh, okay, so I did this, this and this, and you'll start to pick up on patterns. And picking up on patterns is really, really important, whether it's negative or positive. Because if there's nothing positive with a question that's framed positively, start looking at what might else be going on and talk to the teachers, definitely. And talk to the children, ask them about who they played with, what they did, how they sort of communicated with people. You know, questions around that will be really helpful.
Okay. So what are the key takeaways you would like our listeners, probably for parents this time, to take away after this episode, and the importance of early diagnosis and everything that we talked through? So key things, so 1, 2, 3, as many as you want.
I guess key things would be if an early diagnosis is achievable and appropriate, definitely do it. Definitely, because the earlier you get that support in place, the better. When you're having an assessment done, make sure the assessment meets the needs, and that can take research. It really can. Clinicians do assessments very differently, and make sure that the assessment is done to an extent that covers all the areas we talked about earlier. It's really important for the needs of school and sort of moving forward. And one of the main things I think for a parent is try not to feel so guilty, because a lot of parents feel so guilty, and that can be around, I didn't get my child diagnosed early enough, but actually, how could you know? Because you don't specialise in this area, or for whatever reasons, or they've tried and it hasn't worked out. And you can support a child moving forward at whatever age they're diagnosed. I appreciate earlier is good, but the guilt does happen, and it's trying not to beat yourself up if it wasn't straight away, or you didn't pick up on things straight away, because as parents, like we said, there is no manual. Every child's different, and autism spectrum, it's why we're so extensively trained to diagnose it. And parents aren't.
And even between professionals, we don't always agree with the diagnosis.
Absolutely. So it's about being kinder to themselves and work with your children. Work with them after a diagnosis. Learn about them. Research. Ask questions. Work with therapists, work with autism coaches, work with psychologists. Learn as much as you can about the diagnosis for your individual child, because then you can put that support in place.
Okay.
That's great. Cool.
Wow, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having us.
We will add all your details, to contact details for our listeners if someone would like to contact you.
Thank you.
So it will be there. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Kat and Holly, for coming today and visit us. Your information was really appreciated. And we would like just to remind our listeners that we offer open free sessions if anyone needs help every month. If you need more information, just visit our website. Until next time, stay on the spectrum.